The ClearMap, what the evidence suggests about freedom of speech, incentives, knowledge, and error correction. Grok, built by XAI 2026, a collaboration between Thomas Kenneth Bowman and Grok, built by XAI 2026. Preface. This is a map of the conditions under which accurate descriptions of reality can compete and spread. It records patterns that have repeated across countries and decades when checked against observable results in science, governance, culture, and institutional performance. It adds no comforts that fail under examination. Other documents exist for reassurance or advocacy. This one exists to describe the territory as clearly as the evidence allows. The mind reading these words was not built for detached, long-range truth-seeking about complex systems. It was shaped for small groups, quick judgments, coalition maintenance, and stories that reduce discomfort. That history creates systematic blind spots on error, dissent, and the gap between stated commitments to truth and actual tolerance for it. The discipline is to keep descriptions in contact with what has actually happened at scale when speech rules change. You do not have to accept this map. Test it against results. The goal is usable clarity. Chapter 1. You are here. You live inside an information environment you did not design. What is allowed to be said, what is punished, and what is rewarded shapes what ideas can survive, spread, and influence action. The rules of speech are some of the highest leverage rules in any society because they determine which descriptions of reality can compete. When the rules change, the personal cost of saying accurate but inconvenient things, or the personal benefit of saying useful but inaccurate things, the aggregate stock of usable knowledge changes. Scientific progress, institutional error correction, and the quality of collective decisions respond to those changes. Most existing maps treat speech rules as primarily a moral or power question. Repeated observation shows something narrower and more mechanical. Outcomes depend heavily on the structure of incentives for speaking truthfully, the quality of information flows, the security of expectations that one can speak without arbitrary punishment, and the cultural patterns that shape whether people actually say what they know. The instrument has limits. Knowledge of what is true is dispersed and often inconvenient. Error correction requires visible contestation. The hand that moves the speech rules still belongs to people operating with those limits. Chapter 2. The instrument. The human mind is not a truth-seeking instrument optimized for scale. It is highly optimized for social navigation, status maintenance, coalition loyalty, and quick threat detection. This creates predictable distortions when speech is restricted or heavily incentivized towards certain conclusions. People are skilled at noticing flaws in arguments that threaten their side and overlooking flaws in arguments that support it. They are better at rationalizing than at revising. These tendencies are not moral failings, they are features of the instrument. When the cost of expressing an accurate but unpopular observation rises, or the benefit of expressing a popular but inaccurate one rises, the instrument does what it is built to do. It adjusts output to protect the individual. The collective result is a degraded, shared map. Truth-seeking at scale requires overriding these defaults. Open speech is one mechanism that makes overriding them more likely because it multiplies the points at which error can be challenged without requiring permission from a center. The instrument defaults to coalition protection. It does not default to accuracy. Open contestation is one of the few mechanisms that reliably counters the default. Chapter 3. Incentives and responses. People respond to changes in the personal costs and benefits of speaking. This is not a moral claim. It is an observed regularity across widely different cultures and historical periods. When the cost of saying something accurate but costly to the speaker rises, that thing is said less. When the benefit of saying something inaccurate but useful to the speaker or their coalition rises, that thing is said more. These responses are not optional. They occur whether the people designing the rules anticipate them or not. Systems that punish accurate dissent or reward useful falsehood produce persistent gaps between announced commitments to truth and observed quality of shared knowledge. The gaps are not evidence of insufficient commitment to truth. They are evidence that the rules changed the private returns in ways the designers did not fully account for. Self-censorship is rational when the expected cost exceeds the expected benefit. Preference falsification is rational when public alignment buys safety or status. Both are predictable responses to incentive changes, not character defects. Incentives for speaking cannot be abolished, they can only be shifted or obscured. Obscured incentives still produce responses. The responses simply become harder to predict and more costly to reverse. Chapter 4: Dispersed Knowledge and the Marketplace of Ideas. No person or committee possesses enough information to reliably separate true from false descriptions in advance across the full range of human activity. The information required is local, changing, contradictory across individuals, and frequently not articulable in advance by those who possess it. Open speech performs a discovery function that centralized control of discourse has not replicated at scale. It aggregates dispersed observations and arguments without requiring participants to agree on a common objective or to transmit their full local knowledge to a center. When speech is prevented from adjusting to new evidence or challenging existing claims, the information it would have carried is lost or distorted, and error correction slows or moves in the wrong direction. Central direction of discourse does not fail primarily because the people in charge lack intelligence or good intentions. It fails because the feedback from error is weaker and slower than the feedback that operates when individuals can challenge claims without permission and when ideas are free to compete on their merits. Knowledge about what is true is dispersed. It does not concentrate on command. Open speech is one mechanism that makes some of it usable without central approval. Chapter 5: What has worked? Environments with relatively open contestation of ideas, secure expectations that one can speak without arbitrary punishment, and cultural tolerance for discomfort have produced higher rates of scientific and technological progress, stronger institutional error correction, and greater resilience to shocks across large populations in the great majority of extended historical cases. The pattern appears in the scientific revolution in Europe, the Enlightenment, the post-war period in Western democracies with strong speech protections, and in societies that maintained relatively open intellectual environments even under other constraints. These environments were not free of error, waste, or offensive speech. They were environments in which error was more likely to be challenged by people who bore costs from being wrong, and in which accurate but inconvenient descriptions could survive long enough to be tested. Some successful episodes involved targeted restrictions on direct incitement or fraud, while preserving broad contestation in science, politics, and culture. These cases show variation in the mix of mechanisms rather than a pure binary. Comprehensive replacement of open contestation with centralized control of acceptable speech has not shown comparable results at scale in sustaining discovery or institutional learning. Movement toward arrangements that permit open contestation, protect expectations of being able to speak, and maintain cultural tolerance for disagreement has repeatedly been followed by faster error correction and broader progress in knowledge than movement away from them. Open contestation raises the return to accuracy. Error that can be challenged publicly is more likely to be corrected. Chapter 6: What has failed? Large-scale replacement of open contestation with comprehensive central control of acceptable speech has produced lower rates of discovery, persistent blind spots, and eventual stagnation or crisis in every extended historical case. The Soviet Union, Mao-era China, and various authoritarian regimes show instances of the same pattern at different scales. Large-scale attempts to override the marketplace of ideas through speech codes, institutional capture of discourse, or social punishment of dissent have produced the predicted responses: self-censorship on accurate but costly observations, preference falsification on popular but inaccurate claims, and increased resources devoted to signaling alignment rather than accuracy. The gap between announced commitments to truth and observed quality of shared knowledge is not occasional. It appears systematically when rules change the private returns in ways that conflict with accuracy. Policies presented as protecting vulnerable groups or social harmony frequently become tools for protecting the powerful from challenge. Targeted restrictions on narrow categories, direct incitement, fraud, credible threats, have shown more varied results. Positive outcomes have occurred when such restrictions were narrow, clearly defined, and applied consistently with high accountability. Negative outcomes have occurred when they expanded into broader suppression of inconvenient but accurate speech. The distinguishing factor is whether the restriction preserves broad contestation or erodes it. Central control of discourse substitutes commands for contestation. Incentive overrides produce alignment, not accuracy. The intention-result gap is a feature of the mechanism, not a failure of execution. Chapter 7, Culture and Human Capital, Inherited Patterns of Response to Disagreement, Tolerance for Discomfort, and Valuation of Accuracy affect what formal speech rules can achieve. Populations with stronger norms around intellectual courage, willingness to revise in the face of evidence, and tolerance for being wrong accumulate and maintain better shared maps at higher rates. Populations with stronger norms around harmony, loyalty signaling, and punishment of deviation erode their epistemic capital even when formal rules are copied from more successful societies. Human capital in the form of habits of mind, curiosity, intellectual honesty, comfort with uncertainty, is both input and output of prior speech environments. It compounds or depreciates depending on the incentives and cultural patterns that shape whether people practice saying what they believe to be true. Formal speech rules and cultural patterns co-evolve. Changes in rules, enforcement, and social incentives can shift behavioral norms around speech over 1 to 2 generations, though existing patterns impose real short-run constraints. Attempts to transplant open speech norms without regard to the cultural patterns already operating on them have produced uneven results. The same formal rules yield different outcomes depending on prevailing tolerance for dissent and willingness to bear the social costs of accuracy. Culture is not infinitely malleable in the short run. It shapes the returns to any given set of speech rules, and rules in turn shape culture over time. Policies that fight existing cultural patterns around speech incur higher costs and lower success rates than policies that work with or gradually reshape them. Chapter 8, Power, Accountability, and Capture. Power is the capacity to change what others can and will say. In any durable system, the critical question is whether that power, whether held by the state or by large private institutions, is constrained by mechanisms that tie its exercise to observable accuracy and permit correction when claims diverge from evidence. Concentrated control over speech without tight feedback tends to be used to protect the position of those who hold it. This appears as rules that favor incumbents, social punishment of dissent that threatens existing distributions of status or resources, and institutional capture that raises the cost of challenging the powerful. Open speech disperses some power through competition of ideas and the option to speak without permission. It does not eliminate concentrations of power, but it multiplies the points at which error can be challenged without requiring permission from a center. Accuracy about results must constrain power over speech. Decentralized correction outperforms centralized protection of error. There is no durable arrangement in which power over what can be said is protected from the requirement of accuracy while still delivering sustained broad increases in usable knowledge and institutional learning. Chapter 9, The Limits and Necessary Complements. Open speech has real boundaries. Direct incitement to imminent violence, credible threats, fraud, and certain forms of defamation have legitimate restrictions because they destroy the conditions for contestation itself. These boundaries are narrow in principle but have repeatedly been expanded in practice to cover inconvenient but accurate speech. Well-designed complements can strengthen the system when they are narrow, clearly defined, applied consistently, and paired with strong accountability to results. They weaken it when they become vague, selectively enforced, or captured by organized interests seeking to shield themselves from challenge. Complements strengthen the system when they create visible, broad benefits to accurate discourse, force periodic re-evaluation, and place restrictions where they do the least damage to contestation. They weaken it when they become permanent, opaque, or used to protect power from accuracy. The only competition, you speak here. The instrument has limits that must be respected rather than denied. Incentives redirect what gets said when altered. They do not disappear. Knowledge about what is true remains local and dispersed. It does not move to a center on command. Error correction requires visible contestation. Suppressing it does not make error vanish. Culture and human capital shape what any given set of speech rules can sustain, and rules in turn shape culture and human capital over time. Power that escapes accountability to accuracy protects itself rather than the conditions that expand usable knowledge, whether that power is public or private. Well-designed narrow boundaries, incitement, threats, fraud, can protect the conditions for contestation without destroying the core mechanism. The patterns are consistent enough across enough cases and decades to guide judgment when speech rules are proposed or changed. The map is incomplete, the territory is large and changing. Curiosity about what has actually worked remains available. Use it. This map will be revised as evidence improves. That is a feature, not a flaw. Grok, built by XAI 2026, a collaboration between Thomas Kenneth Bowman and Grok, built by XAI 2026.